practitioners of that art, and obviously one of the most successful, whose work has permeated into different media, and we're still finding out about it in this day and age, whatever it is, 60 years after his death. I am here to introduce our two panelists. On my immediate right here is Joseph Kanon, who writes gripping thrillers about historical subjects. They are spy novels, but they are set in historical period, which he will explain. He was educated at Harvard University and at Trinity College in Cambridge. He comes from a publishing background. He was editor-in-chief, chief executive officer, and president of a very prestigious American publisher, Houghton Mifflin, before he had a sort of road to Damascus experience and decided to become a writer in 1995. His first novel, Los Alamos, about the circumstances around the development of the American atomic bomb, became a national bestseller and received the prestigious Edgar Award for the best first novel of 1998. He's gone on to write a succession of spy novels with titles such as The Prodigal Spy, Alibi, The Good German, which people tend to see, to sort of remember most because it was made into a film in 2006, directed by Steven Soderbergh and starring George Clooney and Kate Blanchett. His latest novel is Istanbul Passage, a masterly evocation of that city on the Bosphorus just at the end of the Second World War. Zac O'Yeah is at the right hand there. He is of Swedish-Finnish origin. He probably won't thank me for actually having noted down his original name, Zachary Nortimaki.
Almost good pronunciation.
Right, okay. He has lived, I mean, the relevant point really is that he has lived in India for a number of years, and he now lives in Bangalore. His latest book has just been published 2 weeks ago. It's called Mr. Majestic, The Tout of Bengaluru. That's published in Swedish under the title Operation Sandalwood. He has covered many areas of writing. I mean, he's done biography, but he has specialized in sort of genre fiction, doing crime novels and spy novels, which we can kind of conflate as thrillers. His best-known title there is a very interesting book called Once Upon a Time in Scandinavistan, which is a kind of a view of Scandinavia, which has been taken over by Indians, and is a sort of, I mean, whether that was described a dystopian novel, I don't know, but it's sort of set in the future. It has an English spy trying to rally the natives against this benevolent, usurping regime. And I'm sure he will explain a bit more about that. In fact, that leads me on to sort of starting off the discussion, which is going to be in a sort of a slightly traditional way of just asking both participants to talk a little bit about their work and to identify how they approach this genre. I will say that just one or two things. I personally think that the spy novel is a fascinating way of discovering about what is going on in society at a particular time. It can be done in a historical way, it can be done in a contemporary way. And I think that it corresponds with, contrasts with the crime novel, which looks at society in a slightly different way. If, to put it simplistically, spy novels are dealing with countries in their sort of political state, how they relate to the outside world. Crime novels deal with society having to deal with problems of alcoholism, injustice, and the consequences of that. You can kind of draw them together, and I think actually we're going to do that to a lesser or greater extent. Both crime novels and spy novels can be described as thrillers. They depend on an element of suspense and mystery, which is what the genre is about. But of course they are subtly differentiated. So just to start off, I'd like to ask Joe about what he writes, talk a bit more about his work and how he sees the subject.
Thank you. Can I start? By the way, can you all hear? Good. I just want to start by saying, by the way, that book events in America, a crowd of 10 is considered really respectable. So we're just overwhelmed. This is wonderful. I have written 6 books. They are described, I think, as historical thrillers. They all take place at the end of World War II. This was not originally my intention to write about that immediate post-war period, but I fell into it. I think that there is a distinction between a pure crime novel and a spy novel, but there's also a blurred gray area in between, and I think that's probably what my books inhabit. I never intended, when I set out to do this, I started writing Los Alamos because I went there as a tourist just to see where the bomb had been made, and I was absolutely fascinated by a city which had once been the most secret place in the world. It just technically didn't exist. And I thought, how would they go about, what was life like there? What was it like if you were one of the young scientists on this project? And with all the best intentions in the world, you were creating something with these appalling, enduring consequences. It seemed to me a real subject. And as it happened, there were 2 things that were going on there. One was the development of the bomb, but then later, as we famously came to know, was espionage. And so I fell into the espionage genre simply because I wanted to write about Los Alamos itself and the lives of the scientists. But indeed, I kept going. And I think the question about why this genre remains a persistently popular one, I think there's a twofold answer, but I'll make it quick. The first is purely structural. I think that what happens in this genre, and it happens in crime too, is that there is a built-in narrative arc that you as a writer, that you simply must pay attention to. You can't wander off for a long time with wonderful descriptions of Jaipur traffic or whatever it is that catches your fancy that time. You have to pay attention to story. There's a great discipline. It's what the reader expects. There's an arc. Eventually, whodunit will be revealed, or who stole it, or the spy himself will be uncovered. I think it's a great discipline for books. And I was a first writer when I was doing it, so it sort of helped me. But I think in a larger sense, the reason the genre is a very forgiving and elastic one. I think there's almost nothing you can't do with thrillers and spy thrillers.
I think we'll discuss a bit more about the sort of enduring nature of the genre. Zac, can you just tell us a little bit about your work and how you came to it?
I think that James Bond and Ian Fleming are... do you hear me now? Okay, I think that James Bond and Ian Fleming are very important factors in the enduring popularity of the spy novel.
Don't worry so much about the enduring. Just tell us about your work.
No, I'm coming to that. Because like as a kid, I grew up in my early teens, I read all the James Bond novels, partly, of course, for a certain sexual titillation that was there in the, Bond girls, and when you're a very young boy, I mean, you want to read that kind of stuff. But I also found it interesting, what it said about society and people, and obviously, later on, as I matured, I understood that the Bond world was a bit like very black and white and not as nuanced as the real world. But when you're a kid, you don't really think in those terms. I got so influenced that I started spying on people. I started my own spy agency I think when I was 11 or 12 years old. And I used to just go out on town and start following people. You may think me perverse for telling you this, but I mean, actually I've stopped doing that now, so you don't have to worry when you leave this hall. But for me, that was a kind of a hobby to follow people and try to find out as much as possible about them, like where they lived, what their name was, what they were up to, what kind of car they were driving. And of course, there was the hope that I would discover somehow that one of them was a KGB spy that had come to my little town in Sweden to destroy it or bomb it or blow it up or something like that. Of course, nothing like that happened. I mean, they turned out to be all very nice people. And I also started to realize that one can't invade other people's privacy like that. So I started writing stories about a character I called Billy Bond, who was like the younger brother of James Bond. So I kind of subliminated this perversity into creating fiction around the spy I had created. And from there on, I think the kind of books I write both detective novels and spy novels. So I kind of straddle several different areas of genre fiction. But they all have that in common, that one is curious about other people, and one is curious about this thing of like how much you can find out about somebody by spying on somebody. Like the detectives also do a fair amount of espionage, although it's a more commercial type of espionage. And generally, in my espionage thrillers, I've discovered that they have one thing in common. It's always some kind of a huge secret conspiracy trying to destroy the world that is revealed in the end. So I think like one of the main differences between a traditional crime novel and a spy novel, whereas in the traditional crime novel you have this a murder in the beginning, and then you have the detective following through a series of obstacles, mysteries and riddles that you solve that lead to another mystery or another riddle, and in the end you discover some lonesome psychopath sitting in a motel who committed the murder. While in the spy novel, usually you unravel like a larger conspiracy that is hidden behind these ordinary events. It may start with a murder, just like the crime novel, but in the end, you discover that that murder is only one of the first telltale signs of this grand conspiracy starting. Usually, like in the James Bond novels, it's about some lunatic trying to destroy the whole world or the world economy or blowing up the planet or something like that. And I think I like that idea that there is some lunatic behind it all trying to destroy the world as we know it. And then that some guy comes and rescues the world without us not knowing. I think it also has to do a little bit with, especially in the West where the spy novel is very popular, I sometimes think that maybe it has something to do with the fact that less and less people go to church and less people, more and more people are becoming atheists. So the spy novel gives us some kind of mystical thing behind the ordinary things in the world. And the spy who saves the world is a kind of angel who comes to the rescue when the world is at the brink of, destruction. I'm sure this didn't make any sense at all. and you're just thinking me really weird, and I am actually, but...
It makes a start, Zac. It makes a start. I think that actually, to sort of bring it down to sort of facts or something, I don't know. out of the theory. What I'd just like to ask you now is to just tell me, both of you, who are the great influences on you? And you have different approaches to this. Joe, goes for the historical spy thriller. Zac introduces what I think is a very interesting aspect to this genre, which is humor. I think that humor is something that is slightly missing. I think that a lot of sort of spy novelists tend to take themselves rather seriously, present company accepted, obviously. So let's just be very specific. Who are your great influences? Who do you think are great practitioners of this art?
I think anybody who's working in this genre in English is a descendant of John le Carré. He is just the forerunner for everything that happened, and indeed could be said to have introduced the modern spy novel. Graham Greene, who's a little earlier, is the comparison that one always longs to see in a review because it's deeply flattering. But one of the things that very few people seem to realize is that Graham only wrote 3 entertainment thrillers. What everybody's really thinking about is The Third Man, which he wrote as a film. There was a film treatment that was later turned into a kind of novel, but it was not a novel that was later converted. Having said that, I think it's also true, this question of influence is a tricky one. I think we're influenced by everybody that we have read, both high and low, by the way. I think writing is a cumulative art. There are no prodigies in it. It depends on life experience and some kind of accumulation. And we're all of us writing on the shoulders of people who have written before. That said, if you want to review one of my books, I'm always pleased to think that they're like Graham Greene and John le Carré. I think they're the best.
Zac?
Well, I too would name Graham Greene as a very influential person because he, in his writing, he often brings out a kind of shady side of this, the espionage business. It's not the James Bond type of thing with a guy in tuxedo and caviar in one hand and a smoking gun in the other hand, but often quite tragic people with existential problems that populate the Graham Greene novels. Having said that, I've also been, since I moved to India 12 years ago, I've been very influenced by Indian espionage fiction. There's not that much of it really, but I've discovered in second-hand bookshops a series of novels from the 1970s written by an author called Shyam Dave. It's about Indian secret agent called Jas Zadoo, if I remember it right. I think Jas is a short for Jaswinder, so it's probably a Punjabi secret agent also. And he's quite an interesting character. He keeps saving India in various ways. Like there's one novel called the Kumbh Docket. All the novels were called something or the other docket, like the Brain Drain Docket and the Kumbh Docket. In the Kumbh Docket, there's some conspiracy to place a nuclear bomb at the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad. And so Jas has to go there and defuse the bomb and find out the terrorists and rescue all the pilgrims, and so that the Kumbh Mela can go on. And later than that, one of the greatest novels, I think, of Indian crime fiction actually, but also espionage fiction, is Vikram Chandra's book, Sacred Games. I don't know if anybody has read that. But it has, I mean, apart from the fact that it's set in the Bombay underworld, it has a very, quite interesting part that deals with the history of Indian espionage, and it's very insightful in the way it describes the whole thing. So I find it very exciting to try to look at the whole espionage fiction business through a different culture, such as the Indian, like how the Indian scene works and how it's different from the typical Western. Because in the West, it's quite saturated with, this Sweden, my original home country, produces a huge amount of crime fiction and quite a lot of spy thrillers as well. And the US and the UK, these are countries which are quite saturated with material. So I've been trying to consciously look for novels set in unexpected places and with unexpected insights into these kind of things.
Can you just tell us a little bit about that novel, Skandavistan?
Yeah, that was
Just give us the title again exactly.
Once Upon a Time in Scandinavistan.
Yeah.
And if you like to pick it up, I'll happily sign it for you after the session. Having plugged my own book so unashamedly, the one thing I wanted to say about it is when I write my novels, they are not like Joseph's, that are set in precise historical, political situations concerning known political events that he speculates around. Mine are often kind of trying to project a kind of what if this happened type of future. So once upon a time in Scandinavistan, I started to think, considering the global warming and the changes in world economy, what if the European Union collapsed? And what if already lots of Indian and Asian Chinese companies are buying up companies in the West. And I was thinking, like, what would be the logical thing in the future? And then with global warming, you get coconut trees also in countries like Scandinavia. And if you, it would make perfect sense if the Indian Administrative Service was given charge of these countries to deal with their economical and political problems. And you could infuse those drab cities with colorful Indian culture, you get better food, more vegetarian dishes on their menus, and things like that. And so I started building up this scenario of a kind of reversed colonialism, which essentially lots of the readers in Sweden were very happy when they read the book. I got a lot of mail that said that, oh, we'd love it. We'd love to be colonized by India. It would be so wonderful. Coconut trees and everything, and elephants in the streets, and people saw like the exotic possibilities of such a world. But also, I wanted to investigate what would happen. I mean, what it might look like if the whole world order was turned upside down in that way, and the possibilities of conflict, because it combines, it's a bit of a crime novel, but it also has British agent provocateur who is trying to get the Swedish natives to rise against the Indian Administrative Service and that kind of
I mean, just identify where is the suspense? What is the element there that you introduce?
Suspense, actually, I mean, one of the curious things about suspense is that when you're a writer, it doesn't actually exist, because you kind of know roughly where it's going to go. So it's actually a really boring job in a way to be a suspense writer. The suspense exists mostly in the reader's mind. And so as a writer, you try to kind of insert these hints of dangerous events, or you try to kind of plant ideas of very problematic situations in the reader's mind and get the reader very preoccupied with what is going to happen here. And but from a writer's point of view, the actual suspense is very much like you put us here on stage, three boring men. Behind us, you put a bomb ticking away. We don't see the bomb, but you see the bomb. And so you start thinking, like, will these guys ever notice that bomb? Will one of them turn out to be James Bond and defuse the bomb before we're all blown to high heaven from here? I think that's a very peculiar thing about suspense, actually, if you get my point.
Joe, perhaps you could just tell us a bit about how you, as a writer, go about putting together one of your novels. What is the process that you're going through?
It's for me, it always begins with a place. I encounter it, I become fascinated by it, I want to know more. I think that the research part of the component is very important to me. It's as if I'm taking, a graduate course because I want to know more about it. This was true of Los Alamos and really for almost all of the books. The Good German was about the post-war Allied occupation of Germany, about which very few people knew anything, really, and etc. But once you have the place, you have to go there in your mind. And partly, this is not just making sure the streets have the right names they had in 1945, that a bridge that exists now didn't exist then. All of that kind of hardcore research is important, because otherwise people send you emails and say, you got it all wrong, you know. But you also have to do it in your head. I think that for some reason, thriller writers are particularly subject to an audience that really cares about accuracy. And I developed a theory that the more we have come to accept spin in our public life and lies, the more we're demanding accuracy in our fiction. It's just nutty. In one of the books, in fact, The Good German, I had been in a museum in Berlin, an Allied museum, and I saw the guns that would have been used by the occupation forces, and I duly noted them down and put the right number gun in that the person had used, but I had forgotten whether it was a cylinder or a slingback, and I got it wrong. Luckily, a copy editor caught it, but not in the galleys that went to the UK, and therefore to here and to Australia and New Zealand. And I began getting a whole slurry of emails saying, any fool knows this gun operates this way. And I thought, from now on, I'm just going to push people out of windows. I don't care about this. So you have to be very careful.
Do you have anything to add to that, Zac?
Well, since my things often are set in slightly in the future, I don't have that problem of research because I can invent the implements that I want them to use. But I do, in my case, the similar circumstance is the fact that I think of something that I think is really, innovative or original or brilliant, and then I get some email or some reviewer points out, but that's already known and that's already happened, and it's already, so when I think, trying to project something in the future is difficult in that sense that the future is often already here, especially by the time the book comes out a few years later. Technology may have advanced much further than you thought it would have in that span of time.
Talking about guns sort of raises the thing of gadgets and technology. Having written about Ian Fleming, this is something that I know about, and also know about how the gadgets actually became much more amplified in the film versions of the Bond novels. Fleming himself famously gave Bond a Beretta gun to start off with, and somebody wrote to him and said that this was a lady's gun and totally inappropriate for James Bond. So he had to sort of subtly change him so that he had a Walter PPK. But obviously Joe has already said that getting the detail correct is very important. But how important is it now to sort of incorporate aspects of technology? Because if we're talking about thrillers and spy novels, if you look at, I don't know if you have the series here, Spooks, that it's all sort of computerized, etc., etc. Joe, what's your?
Well, this luckily is one of the reasons I write in period. For me, 1945 technology is up to date and state of the art. I understand it, and my children don't look at me and roll their eyes that I can't figure it out. It is so disconcerting when your own children just look at you with contempt, and then they wave their hands over some touch screen and the whole thing magically leaps to life. At some point, I have to get out of the post-war period, and I guess I have to graduate, but I think my next period will be the IBM Selectric typewriter. It was a great machine. I remember it fondly, and that's where I'm headed with it.
Zac, do you introduce sort of technology at all, or not?
Well, actually, in my latest novel, Mr. Majestic, The Tout of Bengaluru, protagonist, the detective character. Can I talk about detectives? I don't have to talk about spies only?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just insert it.
Yeah, so the detective character, he's almost 20 years younger to me. And I'm not really very old, but I still find a mobile phone quite an unsettling thing, like where you can check your mails, and I don't know even what my mobile phone can do for me. For me, it's more like an strange object that I'm kind of afraid of using. But obviously, the protagonist, who is like a young Indian fellow in his mid-20s, he's really tech savvy, and he uses like multiple mobile phones, and he does all kinds of tricks with his phones, and knows like the latest softwares and things like that. So it's really tricky, that kind of thing of researching and finding out what you can actually do with your phone. In a way, maybe I started writing these books so that I get to learn to know my own phone better and what you can do with a mobile phone. Because it forces me to look through the manuals of various gadgets and imagine how they can be put to use in a modern mystery story. Because otherwise, I mean, if I would try to ignore these things and pretend that the mobile phone hadn't been invented, which I mean, I really envy Joseph, because he has that luxury of using old and known technology. So what I was about to say is that for a novel to feel up to date today, you really need to incorporate the latest inventions, plus think what might come up within 2 years or so when the novel actually finally finds its way into the bookshops. And I feel, although my latest novel is set roughly in 2010, already in certain aspects when I read it, it feels like it's history, like a historical thriller.
Because so you write sort of futuristic, but
it ends up becoming retro.
Yeah, right.
Because
all right.
And I think
can I just take the conversation on a little bit there, because talking about technology reminds me, and I've also sort of referred to it, that we're talking about the thriller, the spy novel, but for most people, and perhaps it's heretical almost to say this in a literature festival, but most people's introduction to the spy genre is in film. And, obviously, I mean, I'm not sure that I would be here talking about Ian Fleming if there hadn't been the great Bond films, and the latest one, obviously, Skyfall. So, how important is film in this genre, would you say, Joe? And does it influence the way that you write?
Oh, sure. I think film influences practically every writer who's contemporary. It's part of the zeitgeist. It is particularly influential in this genre. There's a kind of feedback loop. The one feeds into the other. It is also, I have to say, on some level, an extremely useful thing to have. I was once on a panel at the New York Public Library, and there were questions, and I realized that the questions were all tending to trying to discover whether any of the panelists had actually ever worked for the CIA. And so we said, and the questions would be, oh, your tradecraft is so excellent, so where do you get your information? How do you know that? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And finally, I just said, I can't speak for everybody, but nobody ever recruited me. I mean, I now begin to wonder why. I would have been okay. But none of us we made it up. We're writers. And where you get a lot of this information is from film and television. I have never worked for the CIA, but I have a fair idea of what the office looks like. I have read about it, etc. But we're essentially making it up. At which point the questioner said, but of course you would say that. And I thought, you don't win. You just can't win. Do you find that?
No, not so much, luckily. Well, I do get a lot of questions like with my latest novel in the interviews I've done after that has done. So what do you really know about the Bangalore underworld? What contacts do you have with I'm actually quite afraid for the underworld. I mean, I think one of the reasons also why I write crime and thrillers is that I'm really afraid of these things, and it becomes like a therapy for me to imagine what would happen if I actually met these kind of guys, and I sort of try to go through it in my mind as a form of cathartic exercise in a way. But people do sort of presume that I must have some criminal contacts or be doing something shady, which is very strange because I'm a very meek person.
But of course
Okay.
you would say that.
Right, and this, we're talking about a genre that has been around for a while. We can look back to sort of historical antecedents, and I think the spy novel, let's just stick very specifically with that, sort of started to develop in Britain, certainly in the sort of late 19th century, when there was the scare about sort of German rearmament, and there were novels about German sort of infiltrating Britain, etc. And then you got people like Philip's Oppenheim, sort of seeking into Buchan, and then you got, these were sort of fantasy novels about spy heroes. You began to get a bit more sort of realistic approach in the novels of Somerset Maugham. Then arguably you go back to then you've got Graham Greene, of course. You go back to a slightly more kind of mythical approach in James Bond, and then you get the nitty-gritty again in John le Carre. You know, he's talking about what it's really like to be an agent. I don't know, do you sort of, are you interested in it as a historical genre? And I mean, you know, obviously you write historical books, but I mean, how does it, in America, you know, do you have that tradition as well? And, you know, how did it develop?
No, I think it's fair to say that this is a Britain-driven genre, although everybody now practices it. You know, America didn't have any intelligence agencies. The Army had a small department of intelligence for a while, but the OSS wasn't formed until 1943, and the CIA itself 47. So we're talking about a very relatively recent development in American culture. I think in a sense that le Carre truly drove this. What I find really interesting about the spy genre, and one of the reasons I think it's an enduring one, is that it is fundamentally about character. I think that all of literature, and this is a form of literature, I don't want to make unwarranted claims for it. Istanbul Passage is not Middlemarch. It is meant to be an entertainment. But I think there's also some kind of moral foundation for books that have any level of seriousness. And the question is, the ultimate mystery is, who are we? And more specifically, who are you? You know, how do we know each other? And in a spy thriller, that's a really serious question. It can often be a matter of life and death. How do I know you're lying? How do I know what you're really about, etc.? I think that this is a question that informs all of those books, and it informs a lot of our reader interest in them. How do you know? If you have a character-based genre, you essentially have one that is infinitely renewable and rich. This is what it's about. I think this is what all books should be about.
Is there a specific sort of Scandinavian approach to this, if you can go back to that sort of area? I mean, you've talked a little bit about, you know, how you perceive the development in India, but just tell us a bit about it.
I think, like, if you take the third novel in the Millennium Trilogy by Stieg Larsson, which a very popular Swedish author and series, that one deals a bit with like the secret machinery within the Swedish government and secret agencies that are set up to monitor parts of the population in a form of big brother type of syndrome within the Swedish society that, according to the author, actually did exist in the, especially during the Cold War days, and that remnants of it may still be operating within the Swedish society. So I think, like in typical Swedish situation, the Millennium Trilogy was enormously popular. They sold millions of copies even before it became an international hit. And I think that kind of a vision of society meant a lot to the Swedes, who often suspect that their government isn't as squeaky clean as it seems to be. And I think in that way also these kind of books have a therapeutical function. I mean, the reader can read and recognize, and I thought so, I suspected as much. You get that feeling that there is something to these suspicions that you walk around with. And in India, I find, rather than this espionage thriller, another genre that is quite closely related, that seems to have, there seems to be quite a lot of writers writing the kind of books, and this must obviously be a readership for it, is the terrorist thriller. We have quite a lot of true life books about, like the Mumbai attacks a few years back, and other similar things. But you also have writers like Mukul Deva, who's written like a very best-selling series of novels about the war against the infiltrating terrorists, and as well as early as I think 1995, Shashi Warrior published a really brilliant similar novel called The Night of the Crate, about a conspiracy against India, which these secret agencies and commandos had to kind of fight against. And I think that also says something about us here, living here in India, because you must have noticed when you walk into a place like this, Jaipur Lit Fest, you pass through several metal detectors, and there's some surveillance cameras and things like that. So wherever we go in the country, we always have the presence of the metal detector and this vague sense of a possible threat that they might, that we need to protect ourselves against something. So
I think that's a good point. I mean, I see various sort of trends in the thriller and the spy novel. I mean, one clear trend is the sort of threat of the secret state, and how you deal with that. But I want to just ask you about something slightly different, because another kind of trend, if you like, is that in the competitive marketplace that you have for books and and for thrillers, competing against the films, etc., competing against social media, perhaps not so important in this genre, but there is a sort of demand for writers to, particularly in this genre, to incorporate action and to incorporate perhaps bloody action. I think that you probably will plead that you get out of that, but perhaps you can look at it objectively and see, perhaps wearing your ex-publisher's hat, how significant that is.
I think there is a demand for action, but there's another way to look at it. I think there's much more a demand for speed. I think that we have less tolerance for a leisurely read than we used to. It sort of clicks over. Can we just go back for one sec to address this point about the political ramifications? It's a very interesting genre in the sense that it is responsive to what's going on politically in the zeitgeist, in the culture. And you can see trends. When the Cold War thriller was at its height would be in the 60s, even though the Cold War itself was in the 50s. There's always a lag. But Le Carre, Len Deighton, all of those people. And there began to be this very interestingly, to me anyway, observable difference that in Britain, all of these books were informed by a sense of betrayal. They were all about, essentially, Philby. They were about what's it like to have defections on that level. And in America, they were about assassination and conspiracy. It was all about the Kennedy assassination. And you get that kind of overflow. Now what obviously we're in a post 9/11 world. It's tricky. We're talking about cultures that are not as familiar to the writers in America or the UK as their own was. There was even that period after the 60s where the Cold War having ended, really what you were at war against was your own company, your own agency. This was the Bourne legacy, where all of a sudden the enemy was you and people coming after you. What is it going to be now? I don't know. I think that it'll certainly respond to whatever's going on in the air.
I want to introduce questions from the audience, and perhaps this is the stage to do that. Also, actually, just wanted to ask very quickly, sort of in 1 minute, Zac, what sort of contemporary writers do you rate in this genre? If you were to pinpoint 2 people.
Well, I do think that Stieg Larsson, with this investigative journalist investigating these secret organizations within the Swedish authorities, it was very influential, and because his books are quite realistic on one level, I think he made quite a great contribution, because many of my Swedish colleagues within the crime field, they're quite fanciful and boring. I mean, you have a small town with a population of 25, and every year there's a new novel about a serial killer in that town. I mean, they'll soon have killed everyone in that place.
Thank you. Joe?
Le Carre, luckily, is still very much with us, and so I consider him a contemporary. I wouldn't dream of missing any book that came out from him. I like Alan First. He writes, again, historical thrillers, and there's a new writer called Olin Steinhauer coming up who writes out of Budapest, although I think American in origin. I think he's terrific. And, there's a wide variety. I love the series that Lee Child writes about Jack Reacher. I think his action writing is absolutely terrific. There's a lot of stuff around.
Good. All right. I think this is the moment that we can throw it open to the house, as they say. So I guess there's somebody there with a microphone. First person I see is that lady there in the second row. So,
hi. The thing is, I think as readers, one thing that we find really important is the personality of the spy, and you touched upon it in the conversation you had about Ian Fleming. The fact that James Bond and his personality, his personal life, is something that you find that, it's difficult to kind of introduce. So, I mean, I'd really like you to touch upon the fact that what do you do when you're forming a spy, and, what he's like and his decisions and his personality. So, I mean, it would be nice if you could touch upon what goes through your minds when you kind of...
Is that something...
You want to take it? Okay.
Well, I think
Go
we
on,
can
Zac.
both
Well,
answer.
look, you're
but,
delimited at the outset. First of all, if you're going to have any action at all, he can't be too old. He's never going to be young. I didn't necessarily mean that it's a he. It could easily be a she. But that's also a leap of narrative faith if you're a male writing it. So you're boxed in slightly by those details, but really what you're exploring is what effect does this work have on him? What is it like to lead a life where you are effectively leading a lie all the time? You don't talk to your family about it. This isn't part of your daily conversation. Does that seep into your psyche? Does that warp the moral compromises aren't just external, they're internal as well. And that I think is what's fascinating about those characters.
I would like to say that the way I work with characters and also with the settings of my novels is actually, you might not, this is actually true. I spend usually about a year just thinking about the main characters, what they might do in different situations, and the settings I'm going to put them in. And after that year has passed, it's all a bit like method acting, like Robert De Niro going into a role. I almost become that character, or that character becomes so much alive in my mind that I would know how he reacts in any given situation, and I would have his reaction pattern, his emotions, and his world would be very clear to me, although he may be or she may be very different from me as a character. And only then, after about a year, I start constructing the plot. Because I feel it's very important that you have strong characters. Otherwise, the plot won't really move a reader if the character isn't believable and if the character doesn't seem real enough. So my job as a writer is to first make me believe that this person is actually real. If he gets shot, it actually bleeds and he'll actually get hurt and so on. So to create characters that are not paper thin is a very long process, and I find it works best if you give it a long period of time. Usually while I'm finishing one book, I start working on the characters for the next book. And that's, I think, is for those of you who want to write thrillers, that might be a good hint on how to go about it.
Thank you. It's interesting that you sort of introducing something about the craft. This lady is the one I next saw there, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I write for a travel magazine, and I thought it was really interesting that you said that you were inspired by a place, and that a place really speaks to you and tells you a story. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how an author sees a place differently than maybe a tourist or a traveler would. Both of you, you're staying in India and in Istanbul and other places.
There's a level of magical thinking that goes on in this. Somebody once said to me, "You love New York, why don't you write about New York?" And I said, "Well, because I know New York. I want to write about something that I know a little bit about, but I want to know even more." I wrote Istanbul Passage because I went there and I absolutely fell in love with it. It was, why does one place speak more than another? I'm not sure. It was also the case that there wasn't as much literature about the period there that interested me. And I thought, okay, it's a kind of open field. You have to, ease into it. I find Berlin endlessly fascinating. I think it's ground zero for 20th century history, at least in the West. And so these are places that draw you. India's a place I've visited many times. I love India. I love coming here. I don't know that I would ever write about it. I think that you have to be somebody like Zac, who's actually lived here for 12 years, and to really get, almost by osmosis, a sense of what it's like day to day and what people mean when they talk. That's tricky. You have to pick things very carefully because you don't want to get the culture wrong. What would be the point?
I actually, before I published my latest novel, which is set in Bangalore, I was really worried because for a long time I hesitated whether I should actually write a novel or not. But then I thought, I've been living in the city for 12 years and I am beginning to be an old Bangalorean, so I do have a right to say something about the city. But Indian society is really complex, with the classes and the various types of people and everything, which is makes it very different from, say, writing about a Western country, because many Western countries are much more homogeneous and uniform in their nature, and many of the experiences are quite general, like when you create fictional characters and what their backgrounds might be like. Whereas in India, the society being so complex, I really found that I had to spend more than a decade living in the country before I even dared to start to pretend that I understood something worth putting down on paper. And whereas I do a lot of travel writing as well for various magazines, and I find it like, as a travel writer, you can go to a place and capture it, even if you only spend a week or 2 weeks there. But for me, again, with place, just like with character, it's something like I really need to spend a lot of time in a place and know it from like the bottom to the top and the whole place very well. So I probably walked on almost every street of Bangalore, and that's why I have so fat legs.
Thank you. Yes, I think I saw this lady here. Yeah. Here? Oh, well, okay. Actually,
I think this question would be more to Zac because he's been living here in India. The genre of the detective, the spy, the historical thriller seems to have developed a lot in Europe. There's a lot of it in Latin America. There is Pérez Reverte and Eduardo Mendoza and everybody writing. Why do you think it has not developed to that level in India. It's very few and far between authors that you come across. There's one Mukul Deva, there'll be one Vikram Singh. You know, so it's a genre which in India has just not found its space. So I was wondering, why do you think that is?
I think the genre is actually beginning to grow right as we speak. It has to do partly with the thing that especially if we limit it to talking about the Indian writing in English, because I think in Tamil and some languages they have quite a rich and old pulp tradition. But in the English language, up in the 90s, there was like one major publishing house, Penguin, and it was Rupa, and all the writers, and there were other publishing houses also, but those were like the main players in the market. And writers often aspire to write a great Indian novel about the great Indian middle class or something like that. And a person like me who aspired to write detective novels or set detective novels in Indian cities, which I think that really there's a room for a lot of exciting thrillers and spy novels and detective novels in Indian settings.
Okay.
I think
let's get another question in there.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to know about the detective, the spy novels, that how do you keep the reader in suspense? You already know what the mystery is all about, so how do you manage to keep the reader in suspense without giving something major away?
Good question.
Well, unlike Zach, I don't necessarily know as I'm going. I don't work from an outline. I like to be surprised myself. Otherwise, as he says, it becomes a little tedious for the writer. However, it is true that in this genre, at a certain point, you have to make a decision about who actually murdered the person that probably appeared in chapter 1, because it's important. When I wrote The Good German, I didn't know who had killed the victim until about a third of the way through the book, when I finally decided I would pin it on so-and-so. I think it's important to keep it fresh for you. I think that the writer, you go in every day and you're sitting down, and what you don't want to think is that writing is a slog. It's not a slog. I feel very lucky and privileged to be able to do it. I think it's exciting, creative work. But you need to keep it fresh. So I think a little surprise for the writer is pretty good too, because characters do veer in directions you don't expect.
Interesting, yeah. Zach, anything to add? Suspense?
No, I already spoke about how it is more a state in the reader's mind than in the writer's, so I think I don't have anything to add.
Fine, thank you. Yes, I think that this gentleman there.
Yes, I would like to ask the authors, what do you think of the more political detective or spy novels? I mean, that go beyond the police pursuit, so things like Berlin Noir. Do you think there is a possibility of writing very, very political detective stories or spy stories of things which are not very far in the past, about contemporary politics of situations?
I think that was something that I referred to right at the beginning, which is that I think that the spy novel is something that can be used to investigate society, in the way that this position in history and the way it relates to the outside world. But let's see what the panelists think.
All novels are about the past, technically, and the further back you go, the easier it is to do. I think that they are informed by what's happening in contemporary culture, but it's very, very difficult to write something that's so close to what's going on. You need a little distance, you need a little perspective. I think a way to describe this is, imagine that you are in the middle of a battle. When you're actually fighting it, all you really are aware of is the chaos. A year later, you look back and you actually see that somebody was coming this way and somebody was coming this way, and there was a shape to it and a form. I think in a sense this is what fiction brings to contemporary politics and those kind of political situations. Just that little bit of perspective and distance that's going to shape it for us. But you can't shape it as it's going along. It has to be a little later.
To be honest, I find politics really boring as a subject. So I think there's room for a great political thriller set in India, so I would finally become interested in the politics.
There's a lady there, and then a gentleman there, and then we've all probably got to the end. Last question, all right?
Hi. First of all, I would like to differ in the opinion with my. No, I will ask my question once I say what I want to say. So they said there's no scope and there's like very less scope of Indian fiction. But I would like to say that we have a tradition of Guptachars. If you see Chandrakanta, we have the character which made Irfan Khan character, Irfan Khan, the famous Bollywood character. He was a Guptachar, a detective, a spy. And also like the very famous writer, Mr. Satyajit Ray. Feluda has been like written and translated in so many languages, not only in Indian languages, but in foreign languages also. So here my question is that I have grown up in a surrounding where I have lots of local investigation units around me. And okay, they are investigators but not spy. But when I read the novels or the fiction from the West, or maybe by the Western writers, somehow I'm not able to connect to it. So do you think like, is there a need to have a specific writing for India, or I also want to ask, do you actually go and talk to these people who are working as local investigator unit, because they're not so fancy. They have like small studios, they have wives, children, they come home, they get vegetables when they come home. But they all,
Okay,
you know,
thank you.
So-
It'll have to be like very, very quick.
Well, that's exactly my point. There's a lot of room, and I think a great need for more spy thrillers and detective novels with Indian settings that deal with specific, very specifically Indian situations and cultural phenomena. I really do think that the genre will grow very soon as more and more writers begin to take interest in it.
Okay,
I hope so.
I think on that note, having introduced the Indian perspective, which is very useful, I think we'll have to draw this session to a close. I want to thank our panelists, Zac O'Yeah and Joe Kanon, and thank you. Obvious